protocol of the four powers saying that they would step back from their rights and responsibilities for Germany with the moment of reunification. That was the 3rd October 1990, so that the reunited Germany would be completely sovereign from its start, from its beginning. By the way, this is the only original copy. We keep it. We are a depository, as it's called. It's normal with international treaties, with multilateral treaties, that there is only one original copy signed and kept by one of the parties or an international organization like the General Secretary of the United Nations, for example, which is also a depository for many, many multilateral treaties. In this case, it was obviously deemed to be appropriate that Germany should be the depository of this treaty. So that's the only place you can see it proudly presented. Well, but it's the basis of one of the pillars on which the modern Germany rests, so to say. Well, that's what I wanted to show you here, but I propose that now we go downstairs. This is the lowest of 3 old strong room floors from the time of the Reichsbank, and you see this old door here. We don't use it any longer. It's protected by law. It's called Denkmalschutz in German language. It's protection of historical monuments. It's very important in Germany, and we couldn't remove it for that reason, even if we wanted. It's not quite the right impression that it gives, for our opinion, because we, as a public archive, we are open to the public. It's been a tradition for more than 90 years now that the Foreign Office has its own archives. The reason was and is that for the purposes of federal policy, historical questions are still more important than for the daily work of other ministries. So everything, generally speaking, that's older than 30 years following the Federal Archives law is open to the public. Records of the German Foreign Office since the year 1870. 1870. That was the year when, for the first time, there was founded a government agency under the name of Foreign Office, Auswärtiges Amt. 1 year it was the Foreign Office of the North German Confederation, Norddeutscher Bund, so to say the predecessor of the German Reich. And as you know, the German Reich was founded in 1871. Since then it was the Foreign Office of the German Reich. And since then we have collected about 26 or 27 kilometers of files. So, at the moment, every year, we get new records to an amount of several thousand, 3, 4, 5,000 of those boxes full of paper, and we have to see where we can store them. But that is going to change probably. We are in a period of change from paper files to electronic files. There is an e-government law. It's the English name, even in German, e-government Gesetz. E-government law that says that from the year 2020, all the correspondence within the federal government agencies should be only electronic. Should be. And of course, e-government, e-files, they will lead to e-archives as well one day in the near future. And so we, like other big archives, are part of the working groups preparing the e-government and, in the long run, the e-archive. But there are still questions open, as you might imagine. It's our task to look that even files of which there will have never been a paper form still can be read after 50 years or 100 years. there is experience with regard to paper files, how to store them. You see, this room is air conditioned, of course. We try to create the right environment so that our precious records will be preserved even after a very long period of time. So there is experience, but there is pretty few experience at the moment with electronic files, and that's of course not the main interest of the IT specialists. They look at the value of the electronic communication today, and they don't think so much what will be with those electronic data after several decades or even 100 years or 200 years. So that's our task, and we are part of the working units, and we won't stop that development. We can't and we won't. In former years, we used to make microfilms of them. That was state of the art then. It's not so long ago, but now it looks like Stone Age. Microfilm, what is that? We are going to digitalize the originals, not from the microfilms, to digitalize in color and high resolution all those files we had microfilmed in former years. And certainly one of the most delicate tasks for archivists after a certain period of time to do an appraisal of the files, if they really will be in the future of historical value or of value for the government or for the citizens, the German citizens. And if we deny both questions, then those files will be destroyed. That doesn't happen before they are about 30 years old, because from the registries we get the files with certain delays, a minimum delay for keeping them. And that's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Some are from the start marked as to be kept permanently, and those files we don't touch. There are working groups of about 3 archivists, and we take every file in hand again once more and have a close look. There is no general rule how to decide. It's always an individual business, and we do it at our best, try to. Of course, we can't exclude errors. But if we didn't do this appraisal, we would already now have to have archives the size of a small town. And I can tell you, after 30 years, some files can be destroyed. Well, let's start with this, because it's very beautiful to look at. It's a Chinese document. It's not a treaty. It's a letter of credence for a Chinese ambassador in the time of the Chinese emperors from the beginning of the 20th century. It's a letter from the Chinese emperor Puyi, the last Chinese emperor Puyi, to his colleague, the German emperor William II, to announce that he, Puyi, had entered the throne. He ascended the throne, and as it was usual at that time, he formally announced that fact to his colleagues and also to the German emperor. And this is the official letter. It has a cover of silk with a dragon. This is very, very long. It's what we call a leporello. I think will be the same term in English. It's written in 2 languages. This is Manchu, the language of the court, because the last Chinese dynasty, they weren't Chinese, they were of Mongolian descent. So Manchu was the language of the court, and then it's a Chinese version. And in the center, they meet in the middle of the documents, in the center of the documents, and there is the seal of the Emperor Puyi. You know, at that time, he still was a child of 3 years. Most important, I don't know if anyone of you has seen this film from Bernardo Bertolucci. I think it's from the 1980s or 1990s, The Last Emperor. It's on the life of this last Chinese emperor. It was, some regard it was a sad life because the Chinese empire ended in chaos, more or less. And during a short, brief space of time under Japanese occupation, he became emperor of the Japanese puppet kingdom, empire of Manchukuo. And then, when China became communist, he spent a time in some detention camp, and I think he died in the 1970s as an old man. This is another example of our older records. In fact, it's from 1861, from a time before our main bulk of records starts. It's a treaty between Japan and Prussia, because at that time no German Empire existed still. It was an adventure, 1861. That was only a short time after Japan opened, somewhat unwillingly, to foreign influence, foreign trade. And Prussia was, it was the rising leading power in Germany, and so the Prussian government financed a small flotilla of 3 vessels, one of them being a steam vessel, very, very modern. And they went from the Baltic Sea to East Asia, visiting Japan, China, and what was then Siam, Thailand of our days, with the purpose of concluding treaties of commerce, friendship, navigation. And they first went to Japan because this was regarded as the most difficult task. And I think the negotiations took pretty long. One vessel sunk just off the coast of Japan in a storm with all hands. The 2 managed to arrive at Osaka near Edo, which now is Tokyo. And in the end, they concluded this treaty here. This is the full power for the leader of the expedition, a Prussian diplomat, Count Eulenburg. And it's written in French. It was standard in Europe in those days. But of course, French was no common language in Japan at that time. So the treaty itself was written, as usual, in German and in Japan. But there was used a 3rd language that's done still today if countries concluding a treaty are very, very distant in cultural and language matters. Then there is a 3rd language. Today it's usually English as intermediate language, and if there are differences about the meaning of some stipulations of the treaty, the English version is the decisive version. But at that time it wasn't English in Japan. Before the opening of Japan, you know the story of Commodore Perry, the American captain who more or less forced open the Japanese ports. Before that time, there was only one possibility for foreign trade. That was on a small island near Nagasaki, I think. There was a Dutch colony allowed to do trade with Japan and foreign countries. So there were only Dutch interpreters and translators available in Japan at that time. So you see, this is, I think, the only international treaty we can keep at least, with a Dutch intermediate language. And in the year 2011, this treaty was the basis for huge celebrations in Germany as well as in Japan for 150 years German-Japanese relations. The treaty has long ceased to be enforced formally, legally, but they took it as a basis for the beginning, the start of German-Japanese relations. And you see the cultural difference. The Prussians wanted to conclude the treaty between Japan on one side and Prussia and all the states of the Customs Confederation, the German Zollverein, on the other side. But that's what the Japanese negotiators didn't understand. Why should they conclude a treaty with Prussia and so many other parties which they didn't know? And that was a problem during the negotiations. And one of the Japanese negotiators, he was so desperate, he took his life by formal seppuku. Yes. In your email, you mentioned even also colonial matters. What we have got are only the international treaties on colonial matters. And that doesn't mean, following the understanding of the time then, not mean the treaties which the explorers concluded with the local authorities, the chieftains and kings and sultans, because those treaties at that time, they were not regarded as really international treaties. So we have got the treaties between the colonial powers. And that's one example. It's the so-called Helgoland-Zanzibar Treaty. It's a little bit funny, that name, but it can be explained. It was a treaty between Germany and the United Kingdom on all colonial matters which regarded both parties commonly. That's to say, mostly about the borders between the English colonies in Africa and the German colonies in Africa. It was a general settlement, so to say. And one part of it was that Germany ceded to the United Kingdom its interests in the Isle of Zanzibar, where at first German influence prevailed. And in exchange, Germany got the island of Heligoland in the North Sea, which until then had been British. And a last example, this is a little bit delicate to handle, because some time ago it had to be restored as a treaty on friendship between Germany and Persia, the Iran, and the Iranian instrument of ratification. Generally speaking, the most important treaties that don't enter into force with their signature, even if this is the event photographed and reported in the media, they need to be ratified. There need to be a parliamentary process, and in the end, a document signed by the head of state, the Bundespräsident nowadays. And this is an Iranian instrument of ratification. And this is the cover. It's lacquer work. Lacquer is, what's the expression in English? Lacquer work. And it was virtually in small pieces, and we had it restored, but we thought it worth the effort. But we don't touch it any longer. You see, there are parts missing which couldn't be restored, but most of the old glory can be seen again. It's really a very fine piece of work. I think we have to draw a line here.